Welcome everyone to our World Green Building Week webinar on climate resilience. We will make a start in just 1 minute. Thank you for joining so promptly. Okay, let's make a start just now. Welcome everyone to the World Green Building Council's webinar on climate resilience and adaptation in the built environment. It's our absolute pleasure to have you with us today from locations around the world, both those of you joining us live and watching on the recording. My name is Katrina Brady. I'm the Director of Strategy and Development at the World Green Building Council, and I will be your host for today's session. So if you'll allow me to begin with a brief introduction to the World Green Building Council. We are a global action network comprised of around 70 green building councils from all regions of the world. We work to transform the building and construction sector across 3 strategic areas: climate action, health, well-being and social equity, and resource efficiency in the circular economy. And we represent a collective global membership of over 35,000 organizations dedicated to enhancing sustainability in the built environment. And we welcome you to today's webinar, which is a flagship event of our Building for Everyone campaign, which is the theme of this year's World Green Building Week. So as you can see on screen, we have got hashtags galore for you to join the conversation. So please do join us in communicating about the campaign using the hashtags Building for Everyone and WGBW 2022. Today's event is hosted by our Better Places for People global program of the World GBC Network, which is focused on health, well-being and social equity in the built environment. And we kindly thank our program partners, Bureau Happold, Multiplex, Shaw Contract and Saint-Gobain for their support with this work, which is actively participated in by green building councils in over 30 countries of the world who are aspiring for a sustainable built environment that enhances health and social value for people and planet. So as we are making progress towards the topic of today's webinar, I'd like to frame the conversation in the context of our health and well-being framework. Published in 2020, the principles of our health and well-being framework underpin the work of our Better Places for People program. The health and well-being framework, you can see the halo graphic on screen. It's a high-level educational resource that is structured across 6 core principles for health and well-being in the built environment. The principles are conceptual, so that allows them to be applicable for an international audience and also a diverse range of stakeholders. And they range from topics like indoor environmental quality to occupant behaviors to human rights across the supply chain, and of course, progressing to both mitigation and resilience to climate change. You can find out more about all of these areas and access loads of materials and resources through the website link at the bottom of the slide, worldgbc.org/health-framework. But it's that final topic in Take Climate Action captured within our 6th principle that we're going to be focusing on today. So climate resilience and adaptation is, of course, the subject of today's conversation. And just a small word of background from me to frame our conversation before we hand over to some really insightful experts. In the past 20 years, natural disasters have affected 4.4 billion people, claiming 1.3 million lives and cost $2 trillion in economic losses. By 2050, over 970 cities could be subjected to extreme heat, with over 570 cities impacted by sea level rise, to name just two of the predicted impacts of our changing climate. And as I'm sure we would all expect, far too few cities are prepared for these changes. The extreme heat, the floods, droughts, wildfires that we've seen on the news, we've seen in our own communities and urban hubs around the world in the last few years, have really shown us how unbearable and unlivable our cities could become unless we act now to build resilience whilst also mitigating further climate change. With that in mind, through our Better Places for People programme, the World Green Building Council network and our partners are looking to raise awareness and stimulate action on this critical social, economic and environmental crisis that we're all facing all over the world. In the run-up to COP27, which we know will be taking place in November of this year in Egypt, we will be publishing a guide on resilience, adaptation and the built environment in partnership with the UN High-Level Climate Champions and C40 cities that will share details on some high-level principles and considerations for developers, designers, governments, and a broad suite of stakeholders across the value chain, as well as directing you on to further technical resources. So this will be released in a few weeks' time. The launch date will be during October, and you can find out more about this on the World Green Building Council website, through the national GBCs and on our communications channels over the next few weeks. And we do hope that it will support many of you and of course the wider industry in being able to prioritize resilience and adaptation in your design decisions, in maintenance, development, or even policy recommendations. So it's my great pleasure now to be introducing the first two speakers of today's session, who are going to lead us into the next section of today's event. Please allow me to welcome Duncan Price and Marcia Toledo, who will be exploring the topic of climate resilience and adaptation. We're going to hand over to them for a free conversation so they can dive into detail before we bring in our expert panel. We have 20 minutes of their time, so please do feel free to pose questions for Duncan and Marcia in the chat box, and we will feed those in the last few minutes of the conversation. But first, do allow me to introduce Duncan and Marcia. Duncan Price leads Bureau Happold's Sustainability and Climate Change Consultancy Services. He is a chartered engineer and chartered physicist with over 20 years' experience of business leadership in energy, carbon and sustainability. He has worked with leading UK and international clients to deliver successful policies, strategies and projects across a wide range of sectors. Duncan has an MSc in Energy Systems and the Environment from the University of Clyde and a BSc Hons in Physics and Astronomy from the University of Sheffield. Welcome, Duncan.
Thank you.
And Marcia Toledo, hello. She is the resilience lead of the UNFCCC Climate Champions team. In this role, she oversees the Race to Resilience campaign and manages a programme that focuses on accelerating the pace and scale of adaptation solutions across sectors. I have in my notes that this is everything from water to agriculture, oceans, human settlements, and infrastructure. So quite a scope we've got there, moving towards a resilient and developed world. This includes enhancing the role of non-state actors to address losses and damages. Marcia is originally from Peru, currently lives in Germany, and is a senior professional with 25 years work experience across government, development cooperation, and NGO sectors. Marcia has a biology science degree from Peru, 2 master's degrees from Duke University in the USA on forestry and environmental management, and a master's degree from Hertie School of Governance in Germany. Thank you for joining us, Marcia. So just as a final reminder to our audience today, those of you joining us live, please do feel free to pose questions for Duncan and Marcia in the chat box that we can weave in over the next 20 minutes. But now without any further ado, please allow me to hand over to Duncan and Marcia to talk us through these critical changes in far more detail. Duncan, over to you.
Thanks, Katrina, and hello everybody, wherever you are. Great to be part of this conversation today. So the first part of this is really a discussion between myself and Marcia around the topic of climate resilience and adaptation. And I'm going to start by asking Marcia, how do you define resilience and adaptation?
Thank you, Duncan, and hi everybody as well. I am very happy we're using both terms, adaptation and resilience, in this webinar. And it is, of course, they are both terms very related, complement each other, but they are different. So while we recognize that we need to accelerate global action to a resilient, sustainable world, and this is more urgent than ever, we need to deploy those efforts now, especially focus on adapting to climate change. And we recognize that making progress is already being challenging. We have an increasing of temperature changes in the climate and hazards that allows, and it makes it really difficult to imagine what could be in the future. But in that sense, that's why there is an agenda on deploying those adaptation solutions. For example, one challenge that we know is many people do not live in safe homes and are exposed to risks from climate hazards like extreme heat and flooding. We have, for example, 3 billion people lacking access to adequate housing, and disasters make 14 million more homeless each year. There are also disproportionate impacts on vulnerable populations to take into account, with more than 1 billion urban dwellers in the global south living in informal settlements. So how do we accelerate action to increase resilience in the future? But what is needed that we can do now? So those adaptation solutions very much focus on addressing the impacts of climate change and identifying solutions that are science-based and proven are critical to deploy now. And what we are doing, for example, on the challenge that I just referred, is to make sure that we are identifying those solutions that can withstand climate hazards, that can protect the people. For example, green roofs to absorb water during heavy rains, or stills to prevent against flooding, or cool roof natural airflow channels to protect against extreme heat. All those adaptation solutions are critical to identify what is the opportunity that we can actually accelerate resilience for the people, for the businesses, for the sectors, and for the environment in the future. So perhaps as well, when we think about resilience, it's critical to understand the potential of the adaptation solutions, but as well the articulation with mitigation options, bringing both together and articulate them and enhance the synergies of both solutions are critical, as well very relevant for climate resilience development. At the level of the work that we're doing on the Climate Champions team, we're very eager to accelerate the pace and the scale of adaptation solutions. We're working with partners in the Race to Resilience campaign that has a global goal to increase resilience of 4 billion people by 2030. And the work of the partners that very much touches on the ground are helping us inform what are those solutions that have impact, and how those solutions are also incorporating many different also impacts in regards of resilience attributes, helping people, helping the opportunity, improving knowledge, agency, capacity, etc. And complementing the Race to Resilience campaign, what we're currently identifying is an agenda of adaptation resilience breakthroughs in a way that can better bring more tangible. What are those solutions needed? How can this be deployed? And how can we bring a little bit more a sense of achievable, attainable outcomes by 2030 in regards of adaptations and resilience? This we're calling adaptation and resilience breakthroughs, very much through the spirits of working with the partners for delivering system transformations. So system transformations in food, water, oceans, infrastructure, but specifically to the webinar of today, system interventions and system transformation for human settlements. And we're really looking forward to advance and bring this forward so that we can have a clear pathway for those opportunities and accelerate action on adaptation and resilience. So Duncan, in your case, what is important to consider when thinking of creating a resilient and adaptable built environment? How are you setting up your priorities?
That's a really good question. Thanks, Marcia. I think I'll start by saying that climate adaptation and resilience is a really complex, multi-agency, multidisciplinary challenge. which requires a range of resources to manage climate risk and augment adaptive capacity across a whole portfolio of assets. And that might be buildings, infrastructure, right up to city and district scale. And the impacts of climate risks are social, economic, environmental, and technical. And they really vary considerably based on the local context, the resources, and the capacity. So we tend to follow a three-step process. The first is to begin by carrying out a climate vulnerability assessment. The impacts of climate change are varied, as we say, and it might include overheating, flood risk, water stress, food insecurity, pest and disease. And climate vulnerability is determined based upon both the exposure to these impacts, as well as the sensitivity and the existing level of adaptive capacity within the affected community or asset. So for example, I work with the Los Angeles County Vulnerability Assessment. It's a good example of how proactively you can identify the people, places, and systems most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and then use that to inform the strategies that enable communities to flourish equitably despite the risks faced. Then after climate changes and vulnerabilities are understood, next it's essential to plan how they'll be managed through the development of strategic plans and implementation programs focused on building adaptive capacity and resilience. So for example, the City of London Corporation have been leading the way with innovative and integrated approaches to adaptive pathway planning. And this approach enables short-term action, phased investment, and also the avoidance of maladaptation through a clear framework of long-term decision-making, but based upon climate thresholds and trigger points. And then the third step is design of resilient infrastructure, built assets in the natural environment, including the development of technical design proposals that really embed high levels of adaptive capacity and resilience into the built environment, ensuring that it retains its long-term value. And that'll often involve early stage computer modeling to test designs against the range of future climate scenarios and really designing for flexibility and adaptability. So I guess kind of thinking, question maybe back to you, Marcia, what's the business case? How do we create better places for people in a changing climate and in a climate crisis?
Thank you, Duncan. Yes, so as you said, we cannot ignore the impacts of climate change in regards of the disasters and the people affected, but also on the economic losses that is originating. So we have to see it from that perspective as well. And also the built environment is a critical sector for climate action. The business case is framed in regards of the avoid losses and the transformation opportunities. Here, what is the opportunity that we want to hear regarding achieving a climate resilient development? But especially, how do we bring the people perspective and the benefits to health, safety, and other opportunities as well? So the business case, I would say, it's different and complementary in regards of a city planning for the populations of the city, or the businesses that rely on the opportunity for generation of built environment supply. It's critical that we consider as well what is the impacts on people and how that can be taken into consideration in regards of planning. However, as well, developing a resilient built environment comes with a quadruple win in regards of job creation, identifying opportunities for increased well-being, and incorporating other solutions or technology that can help bring further new opportunities. For example, incorporating nature in the solutions, either direct investments on green infrastructure or combined hybrid investments with green and gray, can bring multiple additional benefits in regards of biodiversity, people well-being, and better services in regards of what are required. So building resilience in that case, it's critical that we can identify what are those opportunities and how we can finance those opportunities that can actually identify and support new businesses, technologies, but also the planning that we need for a more resilient context. For that as well, I guess part of the solutions or part of the approaches in regards of how do we create better places is the understanding the dynamic and the opportunity that have the built environment work with other partners, and that radical collaboration needed. The experience of the engineers, the experience of the planners, the experience of communities and cities managers are critical to identify and better foster those ideas and opportunities, and to tackle that potential fragmentation or silo work. I would say this is also critical in order to create better places, and to drive quality projects, ambition, both adaptation and mitigation. So accelerating that cross collaboration is crucial to achieve market transformations, to identify what are new niches, and to share experience and help accelerate the finance and the scaling of them. And for you, Duncan, what is the cost of inaction, and what is the business case in this for these investments, and how can we create better places for people in a changing climate and climate crisis?
Thanks, Marcia. Yeah, I think it's clear that establishing an effective response is also a financial challenge. Factors such as changing land value, both in high and low risk geographies, new regulatory design and performance standards as we manage overheating, say, or flood risk, and escalating frequency to shock events like pandemics and crop failures. They all have significant financial and planning implications for cities and asset owners. Last year, UK Green Building Council published a really useful framework for measuring and reporting of climate-related physical risk for the built environment, really in recognition of the need for investors, developers, and asset owners to assess the business impacts and build a coherent case for action. In the UK alone, modelling using the RCP 8.5 scenario as a baseline found over 500,000 residential and commercial properties to be at high risk by 2050, meaning affordable insurance may be lost and the value of these properties may decrease. And those adjustments in value brought on by climate risk are estimated to cost over £500 billion by 2100. So if disclosures on climate-related risks and the use by investors, creditors, and underwriters enhanced, then the risk of such large and possibly abrupt corrections in asset values can really be reduced. And we also know that by taking a smart approach to the design and refurbishment of buildings, say, we can avoid future capital expenditure while simultaneously delivering immediate improvements. So, for example, insulating buildings may reduce winter heating energy now and mitigate the risk of overheating in the future, which lowers the future liabilities by reducing the need for further investment to maintain an asset that's attractive to occupiers and that they're prepared to let. Similarly, we're working with residential developers to demonstrate that through good passive design measures such as right orientation, glazing areas, and the use of thermal mass, it's possible to both streamline planning approvals now and ensure residents are happy and comfortable beyond 2030 or 2040, when the developer may wish to refinance the development by selling it to a pension fund, say, that's taken an even longer term view of investment costs and security of revenue. And of course, we know there's so many direct and indirect benefits of climate adaptation and resilience as well. So those direct benefits might include protecting human capital, business operations, and supply chains from physical effects of climate change, staying ahead of regulation, enhanced long-term value, and so on. Perhaps demonstrated through disclosures under TCFD regulations or meeting ESG goals of investors. And then you've got all the indirect benefits, like building relationships with partners and communities by cooperating on resilience measures and enhancing social value by supporting natural capital and protecting local environments. So ultimately, this is about creating buildings, neighborhoods, and cities that are safe, healthy, and attractive places for the long term. I mean, it's really the existential challenge of our time. Katrina, you've come in with some questions.
I've arrived on screen. You're right. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt your conversation, but our audience are starting to share some fantastic questions. And I just want to ask a few of them before we move on. We've got a few very well-known names popping up here. First, a question, Duncan, for you from Bex Porter, asking, our sector often finds it easier to think of built assets as resilient, but less obvious to think of our built static assets as adaptable in the way that, say, a financial system or business model can change over time. Duncan, do you have any examples of an adaptable built solution?
Yes, I do have some examples, actually. Maybe some quite at a building scale and maybe at a city scale, certainly at a building scale, there's examples of buildings that we've designed that have been tested out to 2050, 2080 weather, where when you run the numbers and you do the analysis, you realize that actually the right solution now may be a very low carbon, naturally ventilated building. But we know that even with all the passive design measures, that by 2050 or 2060, you're going to have to introduce some cooling into the space. But the question is, how do you do that in a way which is minimizing cost, allowing that to happen in a very simple way? So actually the critical solution in that example was the floor ceiling height, making sure that it had just enough, it's just generous enough that you could retrofit cooling in the future, or you could take cooling from one space and divert it into another space. So kind of ways of easily adapting the buildings without fundamentally having to take them apart and put them back together. So I can drop some examples into the chat for later if people want to look at that. But I think that's a really critical issue, because you can test, but it's like, well, and so what? What do we do now? So you've got to have the adaptability and the flexibility.
Duncan, that's a great example. Thank you. And yep, any resources you have, we can share with the group. And I think such a good example of why we need to be basing these design decisions off future scenario modeling and data. Thank you for that. And Marcia, I'll come to you just for the closing remark before we move on. I've been asked this literally dozens of times by people who knew you were going to be speaking here today. People would like to learn how they can participate in the race to resilience. Could you tell us a little bit more? How can people get involved?
Fantastic. Thank you, Katrina. Yes, the Race to Resilience was launched in 2021. And we are going to be delivering the first report at COP27 on the work of the different actors that have joined this campaign. And we're, of course, eager to have new actors, new stakeholders, new associations, coalitions, and alliances, businesses and finance sectors and communities joining the campaign. The campaign focused to have a goal of 4 billion people with increased resilience by 2030. We're working in this space with several key partners, for example, Build Change, Rio, the UN Habitat for Humanity, the Work Green Building Council, Resilient Rising, C40s, ICLEI, and others. And in general, the opportunities are to access through the website. I'm going to be placing the link, reaching my colleague Juanita Silva, which is the manager of the campaign, contacting me with ideas, suggestions. We're eager to work with everybody in any way to elevate the work, to highlight the opportunities and many solutions across the many systems that we're working, and as well foster that knowledge exchange, collaboration, building more collaboration, and expanding those solutions across. So your experience, your knowledge, and your ideas are extremely welcome and needed, not only for the key milestones that we have to deliver those successes and opportunities, but also to better reflect the local context, the geographic diversity and specific approaches that actually is about advancing our adaptation and resilience agenda. So thank you. I will be placing the link on the chat.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of people listening live or on the recording who will be taking you up and contacting yourself and your colleagues. Thank you, Marcia. Thank you, Duncan, for all of your insights there. You managed to cram a huge amount into 20 minutes. I'm sorry we don't have longer, but we have another panel to turn to. So thank you very much for joining us. We greatly appreciate your time today, and we look forward to hearing from you again soon. So let's now move over to our second section of the event today. You can see our second panel have arrived up on screen, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Nazmil Huq, Ashok Lal, and Savina Carluccio, who are going to give us a brief talk on their areas of expertise within the topic of climate resilience and share how they're embedding it into their work, as well as once again opening up for questions from the audience. There are a lot of questions already in that we didn't get to that I hope we can pass on to our panel in the next few minutes. We will have one extended answer, then open out to Q&A. But for that, please allow me to introduce our panel. Dr. Nazmil Huq is leading the Resilient Development Programme at the ICLEI World Secretariat. He has 10 years of academic and professional background in climate adaptation and resilience at local, national, and international levels. He's originally from Bangladesh and is currently based in Bonn, Germany. Ashok Law is here today representing the Global Buildings Performance Network and is the principal of Ashok B. Law Architects. His firm was established in 1981 and is committed to an architectural practice based on the principles of environmental sustainability and social responsibility. Ashok has been engaged in architectural education since 1990. He's developed curricula and teaching methods to address environmental issues and has published many articles and presented many papers on environmentally sustainable design and been an active member of institutions and groups promoting awareness and building competence for sustainable building design. And last but not least, Savina is the Executive Director of the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure and is a fervent advocate of the role of civil engineers in tackling our society's biggest challenges. She is an experienced civil engineer and infrastructure practitioner with 2 decades of experience advising government, infrastructure owners and operators, multilateral development banks and NGOs to develop and implement equitable, sustainable and resilient infrastructure that's fit for people and planet. So I'm going to invite each speaker now to give us a 7-minute talk on their views on resilience. Speakers, we are keeping strictly to time, so I'll be popping back up on screen when you have 30 seconds left to go. So we've got time for Q&A afterwards. With that, Nazmo, it's my pleasure to hand over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on the location where you are. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here and speak on behalf of ICLEI and its resilient development activities and how we are also trying to join in the movement of resilient, global resilient development against the backdrop of increasing level of climate change. As I was introduced, my name is Nazmul Haq. I'm originally from Bangladesh and currently I'm leading the Resilient Development Team at the ICLEI World Secretariat, which is based in Bonn. So let me also briefly tell you a little brief about ICLEI, what ICLEI is and how ICLEI is operating and how from the operational perspective, we are also rolling out our resilient development activities. So ICLEI is one of the most active local government networks, currently working more than 2,500 cities, towns, and regions, and their local governments to continue to and to continually pursuing resilient and sustainable development with all the local governments. So the local governments, regional government, and subnational governments are basically our main counterpart with whom we work from various entry points, basically trying to infuse our own strategy, philosophy, and working methods of sustainable development. So for ICLEI, what is sustainable development? For us, the sustainable development is basically standing on 5 pillars. So any development which is basically promoting a low or zero emission, which is building on nature-based, which is resilient, which is equitable, and considering people-centered development, that is what we consider as sustainable development. So resilient development, which is one of the key pathways of ICLEI operational procedure, we consider resilience is an inclusive pathways which should connect all the different pathways, all the different activities, all the different stakeholders of the societies, so that their inclusiveness and their participation will collectively develop a vision of the society, and society or through their local government will aim to achieve that vision. And that is what we are pursuing for, and we consider it as resilient development. So please go to the next slide where I can show our operational philosophy and strategy. Yes, thank you. So for us, resilient development is simply capacities to anticipate, prevent, absorb, and recover from shocks and stresses, which is a very conventional definition of resilient development. But when we want to roll out our philosophy into action, how do we do that with 2,000 or with more than 2,500 member cities, towns, and networks? First, we try to support ICLEI networks, which is ICLEI cities or ICLEI subnational government, to try to enable them resilient development through different projects and activities and capacity building activities. And then we support the ICLEI cities and networks, how all the pathways that I have mentioned, 5 pathways which ICLEI is standing for, is contributing in a holistic, coherent, and inclusive manner to the overarching sustainable development of particular cities and regions. And thirdly, in doing so, we try to improve systems, institutional processes, so that a transparent and robust approach of resilient development could be institutionalized at a local level. So our resilient development, it follows a pathways. Firstly, we understand where the risk is, and secondly, based on the risk, we develop a collective vision. We call it integrated collective vision. And thirdly, then we integrate or we implement that vision through projects and other activities to reduce the current level of vulnerabilities. And then through capacity building activities, we also support cities and our member networks to access to finance so that they can implement their own projects and they can get self-sufficient and self-standing to design, implement, and monitor their own activities. So next slide, please. So I will give you a very brief snapshot of how our resilience journey continues, using a host of initiatives, projects, methodologies, tools, and frameworks. So for example, in the slide, you see that we have I just mentioned there are 3 tools at the very bottom of the slide you see there. And one of the tools we called ICLEI Urban Resilience Planning Cycle. The Urban Resilience Planning Cycle is the first tool by which we understand what are the basic needs of the city. So it is basically following a 3-stage pathways we called analyze, act, and accelerate. So when first city do an analysis of their current status, they have a clear understanding where they need to go and what are their current demands if they want to meet the resilience targets or if they want to be sustainable. And based on that understanding, based on that assessment, definitely then we try to tailor-made our projects and all the projects that we undertake, and so that the projects can really address the city needs and demands. So one of the projects you see in the middle row, I can mention, which is called Urban Shift, which is a JEF 700 project, which is now being implemented in 23 cities of the world, representing 9 countries. So, and this is a continuation of JEF 6 program. So together with JEF 6 and JEF 7, 52 cities are now getting a capacity building support from the 4 implementing partners of Urban Shift project. The implementing partners are C40, WRI, ICLEI, UNEP, and everyone is trying to develop a capacity building support to the cities so that they can develop, design, and implement integrated capacity building integrated project for their cities. So it will simultaneously, it will address resilience and adaptation, but at the same time, it will also be forward looking so that the future mitigation efforts should also be considered inside their overarching integrated climate action plan. So the plan has already been rolled out, and already hundreds of city officials are now being trained, and they are now needing to implement their own city or national projects, which are also being funded through JEF 6 and JEF 7 program. And we consider this Urban Shift is one of the flagship programs for all of our partners. And then once the project is done, we are also very much involved in so many initiatives and where so many like-minded partners and stakeholders are coming together to really create a movement, a shift, so that not only the people mindset could be shifted, but also how the thing should be done, whole the behavioral approach could be shifted. And one of the initiatives my colleagues have already mentioned, that Race to Resilience. But apart from that, we are also involving Making Cities Resilience campaign or Cities for Children, and everywhere we are bringing the convening power of all the different stakeholders, and we we try to diffuse a message that we are all together, so that and sharing our best knowledge available from every partners, so that best knowledge we can make it available irrespective of our disciplinary or institutional boundary to the cities, so that they can get best out of all of the consortium and partnership. So I'd be very happy to answer any of the questions regarding any initiatives, projects and methodologies and tools, and will like to join any further discussion and supporting activities. Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity.
Nazmul, thank you very much. I think that list of initiatives and frameworks that you have presented there will be incredibly helpful for people wanting to learn more about how they can get involved in tackling climate resilience. We have a quick question for you before we move on, a question asking, how do you define shocks and stresses? Is that something you can speak to briefly?
Yes, I see the questions. How do you define shocks and stresses? So to be very briefly, shocks and stresses, it might have a very different dimension and different definitions depending on the context where you are. So shocks could be like societal shocks, shocks could be economical shocks. Now currently we are having shocks could be coming also from originated from climatic induced events, which could be slow onset like droughts or something, or which could be very rapid onset, something like tornado, something like cyclones or other events. So those are all different shocks, and when shocks are coming together, and one shock is really accelerating the other shocks and creating a huge crisis, and that sometimes we define as stresses. So shock and stresses, we sometimes define it together one after another, or sometimes shocks, or very often shocks influences stresses, and it accelerates the complexities of stresses and really hit hard to the very weaker and core part of the society.
Thank you for squeezing that in and defining that for us. We will come back to you in about 15 minutes time, Nazmul, for a few more questions. For now, let's hand over to Ashok, who is going to focus on climate change and healthy, affordable housing, which is a topic we're looking at in a lot of detail in our Better Places for People program. So Ashok, it's my pleasure to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. So I am speaking on behalf of GBPN, Global Building Performance Network. We are engaged in a project which is looking forward to producing a white paper, principally to affect policy, central policy, to look at the long term and the immediate term as a response to the onset of climate change. Well, the big thing that's happening is that there is an exposure to heat waves across the country. And many of the places which are now the main urban centers where concentrations of populations continue to grow, this is increasing rapidly. This has been mapped and it has been studied. And the scientific research, the medical research is showing how these stresses are leading to loss in working hours. They're also leading to the possibility of poor economic outputs. It is also leading to morbidity and illnesses that coincide with these events. So that's the big context. Next slide, please. And this is affecting mainly the poor urban neighborhoods who are the most vulnerable. At the same time, in our country, in India, there's a large program for affordable housing to improve the quality of housing for the poor sections of urban society. Actually, it's meant for all housing needs, rural and urban, but we are here looking at the exacerbation of climate change that happens in urban centers, because this gets exacerbated because of the urban heat island itself. The built environment, therefore, has a crucial role to play in minimizing UHI and the effects of climate change and the consequent health hazards associated with it. Not only that in the long-term future, when people might begin to afford cooling systems and air conditioning, you are asking for much greater demand in energy, and therefore that would again trigger greenhouse gas emissions. We're really thinking of what kind of policy framework we should have, what are the interventions we should have at the central governmental level, at the level of rules and regulations and standards. Next. So another aspect that came out of our thinking was that the active agents in residential precincts and residential environments for managing risks, for managing the resilient processes, for managing adaptation are actually the home keepers, the women. And it means that if you have to look at the way people are living and how they're going to cope with climate change from a gender perspective, then you're going to be truer to the potential of society coping with the need for adaptation and resilience. And we're looking at climate change principally in cities where populations are growing, urbanization is apace, and at the same time, you're finding that a large proportion, 50 to 60% of urban populations don't have good access to good quality housing. And so these are the three elements that we bring together, and out of this we want to produce a white paper that will be a recommendation to the government. Next. What has already started as a reaction to the recent events, the last 3 or 4 years of extreme heat events in some of the cities. This has been mapped, it has been studied. Medical literature from public health is very telling, and you can see the effects of how climate change is having deleterious effects on society. Many and heat action plans are now being planned for many cities. But these heat action plans also recognize that the quality and the manner in which built environments are produced in growing cities are exacerbating the effect of high temperatures and the effect of urban heat island. And therefore, we have to turn our attention to the design and building of homes and neighborhoods themselves. Next. So if we look at two main policy arms, we have the National Urban Housing and Habitat Policy, then we have a National Health Policy. If you look at these together, you'll find that few actions can be taken, and they have to be introduced, as you were told by Nazmul, that cities have to learn how to bring these into a coordinated plan at the city level, but in a hierarchical framework of governance like in India. This has to start by a policy shift, and therefore the flow of finance, flow of supporting infrastructure, flow of legal instruments to make it all possible. So for instance, you will have a requirement for neighborhood level resilience centers to be provided. You'll have to make that the town planning and urban design is coordinated to mitigate climate change impacts, to mitigate the effect of floods and heat waves. The town planning norms, the town planning rules, urban design norms and rules will have to go a sea change in order to cope with this. Climate change resilience measures and neighborhood level resilience centers have to work in coordination with local heat action plans, which are management of heat action, or management of the event, or for about a week or 2 weeks where it lasts. It's about the management of the event. But this has to be coordinated with the way the buildings themselves are being designed for the future. And interestingly, development of transportation and mobility systems is also required to minimize the effect of pollution, which also gets even worse. The respiratory impact of pollution increases with high heat, with high temperatures. We also find that as a result of the last COVID experience, we have to think about limiting the densities in new developments and the growth of urban centers. Next. much of development in the country is determined by the National Building Code and what are called the model building bylaws. These have to change their emphasis now to respond to climate change. Passive design against heat ingress has got to be the major shift. It is still not taken seriously enough. Similarly, urban heat island effects and microclimate enhancement by urban design, by introduction of green and blue infrastructure, is another thing that has to be brought in. Protection from vector diseases by design of building and built environments also has to be brought in into our rules and regulations. And of course, resilience provisions like alternative electricity supply, green electricity supply in case of infrastructure failure, and storage of water for the heat events. Safe storage of water for heat events, for instance, would have to be brought in. Next.
Ashok, if I can give you just one more sentence to sum up, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. So what we're going to do now is actually learn from the ground where some buildings already happened. And we are talking to people, and we are visiting these sites, measuring the real, getting real data on the performance of the buildings, and also subjective information from the residents themselves about how they're coping with heat events. And we're going to take this forward now into a project where we will be partnering with 2 developers to actually integrate as many of the recommendations as possible at an early stage in design, and then monitor the results over a period of 3 or 4 years. And that feedback of the experience of that work on the ground should be something that can reinforce policy. That's going to be the living lab experiment that we want to launch into next. Thank you.
Ashok, thank you very, very much. I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone here when I say we will eagerly look forward to seeing the data and the outcomes from that living lab. Thank you for sharing that with us. And now let me hand over to Savina Carluccio. Over to you, Savina. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'd like to use my time to give you a few thoughts on a topic that is quite important. It's like, how do we put resilience in practice? And my remarks are based on the groundbreaking work that the first 5 years of Resilience Shift delivered. So we know we want to create better places, and we want to make them inclusive, sustainable, and resilient. But we need to do things differently. The old ways are not enough to respond to the complex systemic challenges that we're facing. So to create a shift from theory to practice, so that word was used before. So how do we do this? And we think we need to focus on decisions, the outcomes and the process, and then link them into the actions to implement resilience. So to create those better places, we need sustainable and resilient infrastructure that meets the needs of the community it serves. And this requires thinking beyond what infrastructure is and focus on what it does. So we think about the outcomes that are the resilience value, are the North Stars for resilience that we're driving towards. So the most basic for infrastructure is the service continuity and reliability. But then, as I said, other than the physical infrastructure that needs to be safe and then needs to be reliable, we need to be thinking about what it does. So what is the service that it delivers to the community and the users? And then obviously the value added of resilience is delivering co-benefits, environmental co-benefits, and equity as social co-benefits. So Marcia spoke eloquently about all the different wider benefits that really need to deliver through resilient infrastructure. So then thinking about the process, once we've got those outcomes, the desired outcomes, and then what is the process to get to them? And there are, through our work, we identified some characteristics, some cross-cutting themes. So the first one is system thinking. So system thinking is fundamental. We can't be thinking about resilience without having system thinking just as the forefront, because that helps us address the complexity that is associated with the infrastructure systems that are operating in a changing climate. The second one is future-oriented planning, so particularly for infrastructure that's got such a long lifespan. Obviously, there will be changing in context and conditions, also because of climate change, and so we need to have an eye on the long term. Inclusive engagement is another one, and that was spoke about before. So we need to be bringing others in, the voices that were not heard in the idea generation and decision making in the infrastructure development. So the poor community, the marginalized community, and just really bring them in and make them feel that they're owning the infrastructure. That evidence-based decision making, so collecting, sharing, and using data to then support the decision making, and then also help us monitor the impact, positive impacts that we're trying to achieve. And finally, learning and iteration, because every resilience process needs to be iterative by nature. We need to reassess, course correct, iteratively adapt strategies and processes. So then focus is now on the example that I wanted to bring to you today, which is infrastructure pathways. If we think about guidance tools and standards that are a key enabler for implementation of resilience, the challenge is that there's a large number of them, good guidance tools and standards, but the landscape, the existing landscape is quite crowded, it can be confusing, it's fragmented. So then the practitioners who really need to take action now, they struggle to find what they need to really do things differently and implement and embed resilience in their day jobs. So what we really need to focus on is equipping them with the guidance tools and standards that would make a difference now, while we wait for standards and policies to be in place and to be developed. We don't have time to wait. So they need access to clear, practical, best practice guidance, methods, and tools right now. And so what we can do to avoid that fragmentation and to really bring everyone together, because everyone really needs to be at the table in developing infrastructure, we need to establish that line of sight, those connections across the different practitioners in the infrastructure development. So a key idea is using the life cycle of infrastructure as a framework to connect the different practitioners to the decisions and the actions, but also to use it to organize existing guidance. And this is what you see on screen, is the infrastructure life cycle. And then we've used this in the infrastructure pathways resource that was developed, led by the Resilient Shift in partnership with ICSI, my organization, and delivered by ARUP. This is really a top-class resource that is for practitioners that are searching for that clear, easy to navigate guidance, and then it aims to organize, link, and explain existing information, guidance, and tools, as well as case studies. And those being put together from hundreds of different resources on climate resilient infrastructure across the life cycle. So this is for different types of practitioner, government, infrastructure owner operators, investors, designers. And so it identifies the themes, the actions, the processes, the outcomes. And so it really brings to life what it means to implement resilience in the topic of climate resilient infrastructure. And I'll stop there to just leave a bit of time for questions.
Thank you very much, Sabina. I think it's very helpful for you to frame this in the life cycle of infrastructure, because many of our discussions so far have focused on buildings. We've got to think of an even broader lifespan for civil engineering. Thank you very much. We are coming to the top of the hour, so let me close this session by asking each of our panelists for a closing remark. But this question was posed by Cecile much earlier on in the session today, and it's about the interlink between climate change mitigation and adaptation and resilience. This is a question actually I was asked in advance of this session as well. How can we highlight the fact that these are two equally important areas, and to what extent are the solutions and strategies interlinked? Sabina, would you perhaps like to start us off on this?
Yes, so of course. I think the problem that we face, that we keep on discussing mitigation and adaptation as two separate topics, whereas like we should just really be talking about them at the same time, you know, and hand in hand all the time. And that would help us identify that not all solutions actually are good for adaptation and mitigation. There are some solutions that are probably deliver more resilience and adaptation and less mitigation. So what we need to do is we need to steer. This is something that we do through the resources that I've shown. We need to steer practitioners and stakeholders towards those solutions that but bear in mind the trade-offs between climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And guidance and resources are actually being developed. This is not something that is readily available. You know, the trade-offs are not fully understood. But increasingly, we should be promoting and endorsing those solutions that actually are in that sweet spot to deliver to both adaptation and mitigation. Nature-based solution being one.
Absolutely. And I think a call for further action and understanding on this topic is a really great way to close.
It is, absolutely.
Thank you. And I'm sure that the huge amount of awareness that COP27 will bring will certainly to add a bit of clarity on this topic. Thank you, Savina. Ashok, can I invite you for your closing remarks, please?
Yeah, so my experience, interestingly, is that as we look at the built environment, the way it is developing in our cities here in India, we are seeing that the trends are going in the direction opposite to any kind of mitigation, and therefore making it even more difficult to adapt in the future or become resilient. I'm talking about high density, high rise trends in many cities, especially the big ones, and now even the second-tier cities. So our theory is, and our finding is from our research, is that you rethink the optimal urban grain as something which is simpler, high density, low rise. You'll probably find that in itself, it becomes mitigating because it is less energy intensive to build, less energy intensive to operate, and it produces a microclimate or the potential of a microclimate which has lower UHI, easier resilience in terms of any kind of infrastructure failure. So in fact, these things go together. If you get your urban framework right, then you're moving in the direction of greater mitigation, better resilience, and actually more economic sustainability. That's my take on that one.
Thank you. That's an optimistic closing remark. Thank you for highlighting the co-benefits there. Nazmul.
Thank you. Am I audible? Because my connection is little wobbly. Okay, so I'll be very brief. Whether we are going to win against climate change or not, it will be decided in cities anyway. And we have a very little time window, I would say. And the action we need to take, the rapid emergency action, it needs a very high level of collaboration and cooperation. So government, of course, we like the local governments will play the main role, but they are not enough, and they are severely lacking capacities and finance. So it's now time that all the stakeholders, they should come together and they should share knowledge, because every one of us having our own knowledge, and until we are sharing knowledge, then in next few years we will be again just reinventing the knowledge wheel without sharing what we have already achieved. So that's why everyone should come together, join together, and share our knowledge and capacitate all the local government related and national government and subnational level stakeholders as much as capacitate, so that they can make unified and integrated climate action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nazmul. That was a really clear and very consistent call to action from all three of our panelists there. And with that, it is time to close. Thank you very much to our wonderful panel, to Savina, to Nazmul, to Ashok, and of course to Duncan and Marcia for opening the conversation so well. And of course to all of you for joining us, whether it's watching live or on the recording. There is the second webinar in our Better Places for People series happening on Thursday of this week. This one is on social value and equity in the built environment. You can also find out the latest about what's happening in the World GBC and Partners Building to COP27 campaign with our session tomorrow as well. More details about all of those on the World GBC website and communications channels. If you have any further questions for myself, the World GBC team, or any of our other panelists, please do reach out via the details on screen. But for now, it's been my absolute pleasure to host you today, to host such a fantastic panel discussion, and many thanks to all of our speakers, to all of you, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.
Bye.